Well, I think I told you all last week that I had gone to see another coach um, for a presentation he was making, and from that I watched a uh, documentary called Fat, and then there's Fat Two, and I've seen both of those now. And from that I learned about Eric Westman, and there's this really good book, End of Carb Confusion. I've got some other things coming from him. But, that's one of the things in teaching other people and trying to dig in and figure out where we're getting stuck at and what there is. I learned so much more. So last week I talked to you a lot about the sugar, the sugar, the sugar, the sugar. And tonight I'm going to talk to you about insulin. And I just got so excited this afternoon because this just tied just a number of things together, and particularly with one um, person that I have coached. It really made crystal clear what his issues are, and I'll share some of that tonight without sharing too much. It's personal stuff, but insulin is a hormone. But most hormones don't do just one thing. Insulin is a hormone that controls your blood sugar, but it also does a number of other things. And what is going on with insulin? A lot of it goes with your sugar intake, but it does other things too. And that's why I've had people come to me and they say, well, I don't understand it. Every time I go to the doctor, my fasting blood sugar is just fine, but my A1C is up. And tonight I'm going to teach you some of the things that may be making the A1C being high, even though your fasting ones usually look good. They help you understand it a little bit more. And the A1C is very, very important. People can tell me what their fasting blood sugars are all the time, and I'll always ask, what is your A1C? If you happen to be going to a doctor that's not checking your A1C, and I got really upset recently because a friend of mine was going to see their endocrinologist, and when they got their blood work back, and this is somebody that had been in and out of the pre-diabetic range, they didn't even draw an A1C on them. If you know your doctor is doing blood work on you, ask to do an A1C, even if you don't know. It's something that everybody needs to know about. So we're going to talk about the roles of insulin. And of course, your body secretes insulin when you eat carbs or sugars to regulate blood sugar. But I wonder, did anybody know that insulin controls the release and breakdown of fat? In fact, it's one of the most important things it does. In order for fat to get into cells and be stored, which used to be really important when we were hunter-gatherers, because in the winter you couldn't be out hunting a lot and you needed fat storage. And then when you couldn't hunt a lot, you went longer periods without eating, and the fat was released and it was burned. So insulin is pretty important. The problem is not many of us are going through starvation now, and there is a grocery store on every corner and with all kinds of foods that, a lot that we don't need. So if insulin is not working correctly, it can make it difficult for your body to release fat. What insulin makes your body do very well is to burn sugar or simple carbohydrates. So when you eat that big meal that's got lots of carbohydrates, the insulin is secreted, it's taking care of that, and it's putting the body in burn the sugar, burn the sugar, burn the sugar. And then if it has too much energy, there's too much sugar there, it takes that energy and it stores it away in the fat cells. And that's where we get our love handles and all the different things we have. So that's a very important thing. If you have chronically high insulin levels, it can cause a lot of problems. So who's going to have those just from what you eat? If you're eating a simple carb diet and putting in a lot, and the simple carbs I've talked to you about before, just as bad as the sugars, then you're putting in a lot of energy there, and frequently more than you can burn. And any you do that's more than you can burn, it's going to go to fat. But I'm not sure that I didn't realize some of these things that are correlated with that. So if you chronically have high insulin levels, how many of you know some men who complain about an enlarged prostate? If you are running high insulin levels, which you will if you eat too much sugar and carbs on a regular basis, it leads to benign hypertrophy of the prostate. It also leads to polycystic ovarian syndrome in women. And this is something we see more and more of. And I can tell you that at least once a month, somebody will come to see me, and just by looking at their body shape and the amount of hair on them, I'll ask them, have you ever been diagnosed with PCOS, polycystic ovarian disease? And somebody said, and a lot of them will say, well, I have, but they told me there's nothing I can do for it. Well, that's not really true, but that is very much linked. The other thing is skin tags. And I was thinking about it. I'm someone who's had skin tags all of my life. And when I get really stressed out, and we'll get to the part that stress has with insulin in a little bit, my skin tags get much, much worse. So those are some things that you can look at. Insulin has a huge role in gout and hypertension. So we're going to look at the hypertension first. One of the jobs of insulin is to manage the sodium that the kidneys hold on to. Now, if your kidneys are working just right, when you take in sodium, it shouldn't be a problem because they're going to keep the sodium they need and they're going to release the excess sodium and you're just going to urinate it out. However, if you have too much insulin, it's going to make the kidneys hold on to more sodium. And when that holds on to more sodium, you're going to retain water. And when you retain water, that's going to put more volume in your blood vessels. And that volume is going to create high blood pressure. And as many times as I have read about high blood pressure and all of this, this was a very interesting way to look at it because I have never heard a doctor or a nutritionist say before that instead of putting you on a low sodium diet, what you really needed to do was to manage your insulin levels. Because if you manage the insulin level, you will not have those other problems. So that was just very interesting to me. And this particular doctor pointed out that low sodium diets can be harmful. And so it's really important to think about how you get that insulin under control. Now, certainly high blood pressure is also related to stress. And we have what we call the parasympathetic system. The parasympathetic nervous system is a system, it's our fight or flight. And I don't know, thousands of years ago, if we were running in the bush and there were tigers chasing us, our heart needed to beat and we needed to be able to run as fast as we could. The problem is we live lives now where there's not a lot of that going on. However, if people have lived very stressed lives, if people have lived in abuse and different things, our bodies remember those traumas. And our bodies get set up in a hypervigilance so that we just get all upset, just like if there was a tiger chasing us, or maybe it would be like if there was an abusive husband that was yelling at us, or some other situation, and we kind of relive it, and our body reacts that way. Well, when the fight or flight takes hold, our bodies dump glucophage, right out of the muscles. And part of it is you need that energy because, think about it. You got to run. It's a fight or flight. You got to have the energy. Well, when it does that, it raises the blood sugar. Then the pancreas has to fire and it's sending up high levels of insulin. And those high levels of insulin can be around for a long time. So I've told you about my friend who is Hispanic. And, when I tell him that he needs to learn to live a calmer life, he says, don't you know I'm Latin? And I said, well, you might be Latin, but I want you to live for a while. So I want you to get your Latin under control. And, sometimes it's good to be, a little English where everything is just, they're managing those things better. So this was really, really interesting how that thought comes into place. So when that sympathetic nervous system's high, the insulin levels are high, and your blood pressure's up. But I'm just curious, and unmute yourself if you're muted. Has anybody on here ever heard about gout and high insulin levels or blood sugars being correlated? I had never heard this. And
I never heard of that either.
well, let me tell you something. I have been studying this kind of stuff since I was in undergraduate nursing school, which at this point was 40 years ago, and I'd never heard it. And my Latin friend has had gout and has had problems with uric acid ever since he was a little boy. And when he was a little boy, he had a dad who was pretty mean. And it was a bad situation. He finally went to live with his grandmother. But this really put it all together. So I couldn't wait to call him today. So if you have a healthy kidney, your uric acid is actually is good for us. Uric acid is works to move out free radicals. It's an antioxidant. I've never heard that uric acid was an antioxidant. All I've ever heard is uric acid, because whenever we talk about uric acid, we're talking about it in somebody that has elevated levels, and it's bad. And so they talk to you about staying away from foods that have purines, and that's red meat, shellfish, and a vegetable that has it is cauliflower. Now, this is really interesting because when I was reading about cauliflower I was surprised at that because cauliflower is a really low carb food, but it's high in purines. So, what they try to do is get you to cut down on these foods. But this particular doctor explained that that really wasn't a good idea because these are foods that have a lot of nutrition in them. And that if you're able to keep your carbohydrates low enough, you can probably enjoy those foods and not have the high uric acid level. So that was really interesting to me because when he gets stressed, one thing is when he's stressed, he tends to eat more of the simple carbs, which is not good, and his uric acid always goes up. And he'll say sometimes I haven't even been eating the foods I wasn't supposed to. But all of this is correlated. And now I'm really interested because I want to work with him some and see if we can really keep his carb level low. Because Bishop will understand this. He tells me all the time, he says, Kimball, I'm from Peru. I'm Hispanic. You're telling me not to eat rice. He said, that would be like me telling you not to drink water. And I'm like, yeah, but just don't want to drink that. You don't want to eat that much rice. So I want to see if with low enough carbs, he really is able to manage that uric acid better. Now, sexual dysfunction is also linked to high levels of insulin, and that is an erectile dysfunction. Now, it's kind of interesting. High insulin levels in men causes them to release estrogen from their fat cells, and so they run a higher estrogen level. And therefore, that tends to cause problems with erectile dysfunction. They also talked about men beginning to grow breast tissue. And, right now I'm really, dealing with the situation of my father having his dementia and really realizing how closely correlated his poorly controlled blood sugars have been. And the fact that he ate so many sugars and then the insulin had to run so high, and that creates the insulin resistance. But I can remember 20 years ago, my father getting really upset because he was growing breast. And they thought it was a medication and they took him off of it and it didn't help any of that. He had an enlarged prostate. And so now, reading and learning these things, I can see all the little precursors that were happening in his life to get us with where we are today. Now, women are just the opposite of men. When we have the high insulin levels, we tend to run a higher level of testosterone, which leads to the PCOS and also causes a lot of problems with infertility. And I have seen this. I have worked with a number of women that were having fertility problems with the PCOS, and I would get them to go on, and I love this. Dr. Westman says we don't want to call it a low carb diet. He said that totally freaks most doctors out. He said, so what I tell people is I have my clients use a modified Mediterranean diet. He said they all know or have heard somewhere along the way that the Mediterranean diet is healthy. Well, why is it healthy? Because it has a lot of the good fats, and it's got different meats, and it's got vegetables, but it's got the vegetables in it that are low glycemic index. And he says, and they don't even know what the modified is, but he says that's one of the best things. So I really like that. I always say the Whole30, which is more or less very akin to the Mediterranean. But he said just tell them it's the modified Mediterranean diet. But in working with these women, I have found that we are able to help them get conceived children. And all it's coming down to is, again, I talked to you all about the time, but we're regulating the blood sugar and therefore regulating the insulin levels. Also, if women are having those high insulin levels, they tend to have more painful and irregular cycles. So if you know someone who's having bad cycles, then talking with them about a change in diet can work. So there are ways that they can draw blood and check you for hyperinsulinemia, just like they can glucose. But they say that there's some problems. It needs to be done fasting, and it's not the testings we have are not quite as good as we want. So what they said is that if you have two of the following things, you can probably figure that you have hyperinsulinemia. If you're a woman and you have a waist that is over 35 inches, you are probably in hyperinsulinemia. If you're a man and you have a waist over 40 inches, you're probably in hyperinsulinemia. Your triglycerides are 150 milligrams per deciliter or greater. Your good cholesterol is less than 50 if you're a woman and less than 40 if you're a man. If you have hypertension and your blood pressure is greater than 138/85, that's an indicator. And if you have an elevated fasting glucose that is greater than 100, even if it's in about the 109 range. So if you had two of those, he says you can pretty much count that you are in hyperinsulinemia. And so you're gaining excessive body weight is really a symptom of a metabolic problem rather than a result of it. And so I'll share with you all, when I had to have a complete hysterectomy because of a very large fibroid when I was 45 years old. And at the time I wore size 2s and 4s. And I was tiny. And in the course of a year, I gained 100 pounds. And every time I went into the doctor, I said, what's happening? Because I'm not eating anymore. And they looked at me like I was lying, but I wasn't. And I look at it now, and I believe that when I had that, the estrogen was all gone, the testosterone was dominant, and I went into the hyperinsulinemia. And so that was pretty interesting and a really good thing for women to know that are about to have a hysterectomy. So even if you aren't overweight, you can still be in hyperinsulinemia, and managing your insulin blood glucose levels is very important. So people need to kind of watch it, even if they don't have the excess fat. Now, this did not surprise me at all, and you all know that I'm not a big fan of the medications they use for type 2 diabetes because they make your body pump out more insulin. So what I read on this was the medications that they use can make the hyperinsulinemia worse. And this has been true with the gentleman I was telling you about. Every time he goes on the medications for his diabetes, his blood sugars get higher. And I think the reason that's happening is that the insulin is causing all of these other problems. And then the stress factor comes in. Because, like he told me, I talked to him today. He said, you know what? I woke up this morning with a blood sugar of 182, and I hadn't eaten anything bad before bed. And I said, and he says, and then I had a piece of toast and a piece of carb-free toast. And I forget what he told me he had with it. It may have been some avocado. And he said 2 hours later, my blood sugar dropped to 60. Well, what it was he has this hyperinsulinemia, and the body is going back and forth, back and forth. And so what it comes down to is really working on modulating the insulin you have and modulating your sugars. And you do that by with the low carb diet. Now, part of this is that there's a carbohydrate sensitivity. And I don't know if I've shared this with you all, but when I was a little girl, if I ate a baked potato, my mother would get mad because I would get so sleepy that I was falling asleep at the table. That was probably a sign that I was going to have hyperinsulinemia. And some people are very, they're very carb sensitive. And it comes along with having the chronic insulin levels. So anybody that has PCOS, if they've been diagnosed with that, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, hypoglycemia, gout, skin tags, unexplained hypertension, erectile dysfunction, benign and large prostate, has struggled to lose weight following a low-fat diet, and the weight just doesn't come off, their problem is most likely related to the insulin. And the way to get the insulin levels balanced is through the kind of lifestyle that I'm promoting here, and figuring out how you make that your lifestyle and are able to stick with it, with going out to eat, with traveling, with being around friends. But all of this goes together. And as we age, the whole issue with dementia is just becoming such a big deal. And watching what's happened with my dad, I mean, I really I have a huge heart that this is something I want to educate people on how they can take their lives back. And I'll tell you, just a couple of weeks ago, they came out with a study that showed that if people lowered the simple carbohydrates that they ate, even someone 80 years old might add 2 more good years to their life. So really and truly, when we get down to it, again, the food that we're eating, it can make you sick, it can make you well, but we have a lot of control with the choices that we make. So has anybody got any questions?
No, you're always thorough. No questions from me.
Well,
we got to do it.
Yes. And then next week, I'm going to have some more information. Like I said, this was great. My daughter-in-law is going to be getting back in town on Thursday, and then I'll find out when it is I'm going to carry my dad down to see my son at the coast. And as soon as I know that, I'm going to set a time for you all to come over, because I'm dying for you all to watch Fat One with me. And I'll have all kind. I've got a whole bunch of new recipes that I want to share with you all.
Sounds good.
You all know I love cooking for people.
Right. We look forward to it. Okay.
All right. You all have a great week.
All right. Thank you.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.